Speaking of the war in Ukraine, this is the video I wanted to react to. We're now getting some historian videos about Ukraine, which should be interesting. Some of the most popular videos that we've done on the Midwestern Marx channel have been our videos criticizing the Oversimplified YouTube channel, which is a YouTube channel that does videos very similar to this. They're animated, narrated, scripted, really well done, really well produced, which gives them an air of authority, right? Which gives you a sense that what you're watching is truthful or what you're watching is factual. Of course, you know, if you're a Marxist dialectical materialist, you're going to notice a lot of errors in their reporting. But if you're somebody who's just trying to learn history for the first time, just going on YouTube to Google a historical event or try and figure out what's going on in the world, these are the kind of videos that are going to pop up, right? And because they're well produced, they have this air of authority to where people are going to believe them. So that's why I think it's important to deconstruct these videos. That's why I think our videos deconstructing the Oversimplified series have gotten so popular, because people oftentimes just believe these things at face value. So when somebody deconstructs them and criticizes them, it has a lot of value for people. So yeah, this is Armchair Historian. Does a lot of videos like these. Pretty much every video they've ever put out, I would have a lot of criticisms of. But this is their video on the war in Ukraine summarized.
From widespread destruction to one of the largest refugee crises in the world, consequences of the war in Ukraine have reverberated globally. Today, we're going to delve into the 2022 events from the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and this is the War in Ukraine 2022.
I agree with everything you said so far. Obviously, you just said basic stuff, except for that it's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is, but you have to throw NATO in there. You have to throw the U.S. in there, right? Because where is Ukraine getting their guns? Where is Ukraine getting their weaponry? It's all from the U.S. and NATO. Right. And obviously, this war wouldn't have happened without the U.S. coup in 2014. But I'm sure Armchair Historian would say that the coup is a conspiracy theory. But it's absolutely a conflict between NATO and Russia, because the conflict would have never happened, or it would have ended years ago, or, ended a long time ago if it wasn't for NATO and the U.S. funneling weapons into Ukraine.
Our historical strategy game, Fire and Maneuver, has left early access and is available now. Check it out with the link below.
Should I play their strategy game?
In order to understand the origins of the war, it is crucial to examine the events that triggered the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, starting with the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of hostilities in Donbass. In early 2014, the Euromaidan protests led to the ousting of Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Soon after, Yanukovych fled to Russia. A wave of pro-Russian unrest erupted in eastern and southern Ukraine.
The pro-Russian unrest was going on the whole time that Euromaidan was going on, because people recognized that it was a U.S. coup effort. And we were talking earlier about Victoria Nuland and the things that she has openly admitted. Right? There's a video of her at a speaking engagement that's in the movie Ukraine on Fire, saying that we spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to create Euromaidan, to influence Ukrainian politics and create this color revolution, this uprising that ousted the government and put a more pro-US government in power. Right? So this has been admitted by Victoria Nuland, one of the major players in Ukraine, right? The person crafting, I believe she was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, so crafting U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine. She admitted spending millions and millions of dollars to create Euromaidan and influence Ukrainian politics. For any historian, that should be a big deal, right? That should be something worth mentioning. If a country is spending millions and millions of dollars to create a protest that eventually overthrows another country's government, that's something worth mentioning when you talk about that event. But they just gloss over that. They totally miss that. They don't even bring it up. Why? Because it goes against their narrative. It goes against their narrative that this was just a natural uprising that happened in Ukraine and not an undemocratic coup where the U.S. funneled money into extremist groups who made the protests violent and turned it into an actual overthrow of the government. Also, Crimea wasn't annexed. Crimea voted to join Russia, and even Western polling numbers had like over 80 to 90% of people in Crimea voting to join Russia, or 80 to 90% of them wanted to join Russia. Crimea was only given to Ukraine by Khrushchev, about 70 years ago. So it makes sense that a lot of people there would have an attachment to Russia, especially when they're watching this Nazi coup government backed by the US take over Ukraine. Of course, they wanted to get away from that mess. But if you tell the truth, if you talk about all those facts that I just mentioned, it makes it really difficult to portray Russia as the evil aggressors, right? And it makes it really easy to see NATO as the evil aggressors or the provocateurs of this conflict. And of course, we know the goal of Armchair Historian here is to make you think Russia bad, Russia evil, Russia aggressors. NATO good, NATO helping Ukraine, NATO supporting democracy.
Simultaneously, unmarked Russian troops, which had already been stationed in military bases within Crimea, took control of government buildings, strategic sites, and infrastructure. In March, Moscow would hold a highly contentious referendum, which led to Crimea being annexed by.
So I see someone in the chat saying, where is Crimea? I was going to pull up a map, but here's the map. It's like right off Ukraine, but, it's almost like an island. And then here's Russia over here. So it's like in between them. And like I said, it belonged to Russia, and then Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine. So good question. It's always good to try and know the geography of these areas that we're talking about, because it helps the politics make more sense if you understand, where everything's located.
This referendum, which led to.
My favorite politics professor would be proud of me. He always made us do map quizzes to figure out wherever all the countries are. So he would be glad that I'm encouraging y'all to study geography.
Crimea being annexed by Russia. The results of this referendum were not recognized by the international community. Soon after, armed pro-Russian separatists.
The international community, meaning bourgeois international law, created since its inception at the end of World War II by the U.S. Right, so they'll just leave it at the international community, though. They won't mention all the countries who did recognize the vote in Crimea, but because the U.S. and their allies didn't recognize it. So we'll just call that the international community and call it good. Propaganda.
Seized government buildings in Donbass and proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The separatists received considerable. Seized government buildings in Donbass. Annexed by Russia. The results of this referendum were not recognized by the international community. Soon after, armed pro-Russian separatists seized government buildings in Donbass and proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics.
Why did they do that, Armchair Historian? Why did these separatists want to form their own independent republics? Was it because the U.S. coup put a bunch of Nazis in power? Is it because groups like the Azov Battalion were actually brought into the Ukrainian military? Groups who are anti-Russian and wanted to ban the Russian language and praise Stepan Bandera, which the Ukrainian Nazi government did. They banned the Russian language and made Stepan Bandera the Hitler collaborator during World War II, Ukrainian nationalist, godfather of Ukrainian nationalism, made him a national hero. And then after the Azov Battalion and all these paramilitaries became part of the actual Ukrainian National Guard and had access to the Ukrainian military weapons, they started shelling the homes of people in the Donbass. Right? Between 2014 and 2022, 14,000 people were killed in the Donbass. And yes, some of those were Ukrainian, but a ton of them were women and children and civilians in the Donbass region. So a bunch of them took up arms, and that's what he's calling a separatist group who just seized government buildings for no reason. But they declared themselves independent republics because there was an undemocratic Nazi government installed in Ukraine who started blowing up their houses with artillery. And to just gloss over that and not even mention that it happened is to smear the people of the Donbass as, illegal separatists and to totally just conceal what their actual plight was, what was actually going on, and why they actually wanted to declare themselves independent republics. And if you don't believe me, please go on Twitter or Facebook or wherever and follow Dan Kovalik, a professor and prolific author who spent a lot of time in the Donbass talking to their people, right? Talking to their people about how their homes were shelled and how they were attacked after the coup in 2014. Armchair historian could benefit a lot from listening to those interviews and actually talking to the people of the Donbass before he smears them as evil. And follow the journalism of Wyatt Reed, who was also in the Donbass. And actually right now, Dan Kovalik is in Crimea talking to people about the referendum and about the intervention. So if you want to hear from people who are actually there, from people who are actually in this region, follow Dan Kovalik and Wyatt Reed. If you want to hear a bunch of Western bullshit smearing the people in this region who are fighting for their lives against Western imperialist aggression and coup governments and coup dictatorships, listen to Armchair Historian. But your brain is going to turn to mush if you do.
The separatists received considerable covert support from Russia, and Ukrainian attempts to fully retake the separatist-held areas were unsuccessful. The fighting would continue in 2015. Attempts to fully retake the separatist-held areas were unsuccessful. The fight.
See, they weren't shelling civilian homes. They were just trying to retake these areas taken by the separatists, right? And if it was only a handful of separatists who seized government buildings, why wasn't the Ukrainian military able to take these areas back? It's almost like these whole countries, or the vast majority of people in the Donbass, wanted to be independent republics, right? You wouldn't be able to defend your country if only like 5% of the people in it were separatists and seized the government, right? The reason Ukraine wasn't able to take this region back is because this region doesn't want to be part of Ukraine anymore.
Fighting would continue in 2015, especially around Donetsk, Luhansk, and Mariupol, with the separatists intent on gaining control of the oblasts. Still, the front lines would soon become largely static. As a result, in February 2015, Russia and Ukraine signed the Minsk II agreements in a bid to end the conflict. Although the agreements were never fully implemented, the Donbass war settled into a violent but effectively frozen conflict, with many brief ceasefires, no lasting peace, and few changes in territorial control. A major escalation would happen 3 years later, as the
constant shelling. Yeah, there was no change of territorial control. But the people of the Donbass were living under constant fear that they would have artillery shells come and destroy their homes or destroy their public areas. Because there weren't any changes in territory, no, but the Azov Battalion and these other neo-Nazi paramilitaries, who after the U.S. coup in 2014 actually became part of the Ukrainian military, became part of their actual government, which would be like the U.S. adding the KKK to the National Guard, literally. After that, they just kept launching missiles and launching artillery shells into the Donbass. Which, what do you think? Like, if you took an extremist group in the U.S., like the KKK, and you made them part of the military, yeah, they would start attacking minority groups. They would start attacking black people, right? These are anti-Russian people who hate Russia, Ukrainian ethno-nationalists. So yeah, they started shelling and launching missiles into the Donbass, the place where you have a lot of ethnic Russians and cultural Russians and Russian speakers. But Americans Americans are so disconnected from this. They're like, no, the Azov Battalion kicked all the neo-Nazis out, after the U.S. coup and after they became part of the military. Like, no, they were founded as a neo-Nazi paramilitary. That's their whole thing. Their whole thing is Nazism. That is what they are. That is what they support. They didn't just kick the neo-Nazis out as soon as the U.S. started giving them money and guns. Fucking how naive can you actually be to believe that? It's insane that that's the real U.S. narrative that people believe. People who call themselves historians believe.
The Russian Coast Guard fired upon and captured 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels after they attempted to transit from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov. The Kerch Strait incident flared up tensions, and martial law was briefly declared by Ukraine in fears that a full-scale war would soon break out between the two countries. But new conflict did not come. Nevertheless, as soon as Crimea was annexed, Moscow had begun to integrate the regions under their control, issuing hundreds of thousands of Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens. This violent status quo continued for
How dare they? How dare they? Did they just say this violent status quo? The status quo is violent because Russia gave their citizens a bunch of passports. I'm pretty sure the violence is happening because you made a neo-Nazi battalion part of the military, and they're attacking all the minorities in the country. But what do I know?
years until the beginning of 2021, when Russia built up a large military presence near its border with Ukraine, including from neighboring Belarus. The Kremlin denied any ill will regarding these troop concentrations, stating that they were in the area to perform military exercises.
Where was the U.S. army? Or where was the Ukrainian army amassing? Right on the border of Russia and Ukraine. So Russia was amassing military forces on their border, yes, in response to the NATO forces who were amassing on their border. And Ukraine, Russia had said, if you make Ukraine a part of NATO, we will intervene. We will do something. They warned them about this multiple times. And the Donbass requested that Russia do something about this 10 times before Russia actually did over the course of 7 years or so. So instead of adding Ukraine to NATO, the U.S. just kept training up NATO troops. Troops are NATO interoperable, which means that the troops who the U.S. was amassing on Russia's border in Ukraine could have done missions with or instantly, been compatible with French NATO troops and NATO troops in the UK and NATO troops in Germany. Once these troops are trained in NATO interoperability, they can go do missions with NATO troops anywhere in the world, and they'll all use the same language, and they'll be able to communicate with each other and have the same training. So the U.S. didn't add Ukraine to NATO, but they were making troops NATO interoperable and lining them up on the border. And now we know from Angela Merkel, because she admitted it, that the goal of this was always, always, always to build up military forces, which the U.S. could use to attack Russia. Right? Angela Merkel straight up said that the 2014 proposed Minsk agreements, peace agreements, the U.S. never had any plans to follow it. NATO never had any plans to follow it. Their whole goal was to buy time so they could build up military forces along the border and then attack Russia. So despite the fact that we know that now, this armchair historian guy is only going to bring up the Russian troops. He's literally only bringing up one side of the issue while just not talking about the other side. Russia was amassing troops on the border, clearly threatening Ukraine. Let's completely ignore the fact that NATO and the U.S., a foreign country who's not even anywhere near this region, was amassing troops right on Russia's border. And Russia was aligning their troops in a defensive posture. See, but why tell the truth when we can just completely isolate, half of this map? Half of this map doesn't exist. Let's just look at what Russia's doing so that we can pretend they're doing it for no reason or pretend they're doing it just to be aggressive. Yeah, I mean, what a blatant lie, right? There's no way you could actually look into this issue and know the history of what was going on, right? And still say this stuff unless you know that you're lying and you're just trying to lie on behalf of your donors or whoever.
Nonetheless, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of infringing on the rights of Russian speakers and used Ukrainian collaboration with the Germans in the Second World War to accuse some in the Kyiv government of supporting neo-Nazis.
There are neo-Nazis who are part of their National Guard. The Azov Battalion became part of the Ukrainian National Guard. There are political parties like Right Sector who are openly ethno-nationalist and neo-Nazi who were at the center of the 2014 Euromaidan protests and who received tons of funding and political support from the United States. Right? These are people who have swastika tattoos, who call themselves Nazis and supporters of Stepan Bandera, who are rising to positions of political power and military power in Ukraine after the U.S. funneled millions of dollars into Ukraine. And we know that the U.S. has a history of supporting Nazis when it's convenient for them. Just look at fascists. Just look at the Contras in Nicaragua. But you're going to say it's Russian propaganda that there was anybody leaning towards neo-Nazism in the Ukrainian government? Quit lying. Quit lying. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. If you want people, Tell the truth of what's going on and then let people decide for themselves. But that's not the idea. The idea isn't to give people the facts and let them decide for themselves. It's to omit any facts that go against the US NATO narrative. And it's so obvious to anybody who knows the actual facts. I don't care if you're critical of Russia. I don't care if you say that, I don't support the Russian invasion. I think it was, Putin acted irrationally. It escalated things. It was not the right response for Russia. Sure. But don't lie and say that there were no neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government when there were literal neo-Nazi militias being filtered into the Ukrainian military. Don't blatantly lie to defend fucking Nazis.
Putin argued that Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood, rather that Lenin had created it by carving a Soviet republic out of Russian imperial land, and that Stalin and
kind of a fair critique of Lenin. That's all I'll say.
Khrushchev expanded Ukraine after the Second World War. Putin continued to criticize the enlargement of NATO publicly and demanded that Ukraine be barred from ever joining. Alongside this, he also demanded the removal of multinational forces stationed in NATO's Eastern European member states. These demands were rejected by NATO, and Ukraine, under US influence, continues to seek more integration with the West.
And imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. Imagine if Russia was amassing troops and training troops on the US-Canada border. And the US said, Canada cannot join this Russian military alliance because we're afraid that Russia's going to use Canada to attack us because they're amassing troops right on our border. Right? What would the US do? The US would have invaded Canada yesterday. They would have seen one US troop on the US-Canada border and freaking launched nukes at Canada and Russia simultaneously. If any country, China, Russia, whoever, did to the US what we do to them, the US would respond nuclearly, with nuclear weapons. The US would respond with an utter meltdown if Russia overthrew the Canadian government and started amassing troops on their border. But we're supposed to believe that Russia are the dictators because they said, don't let Ukraine join NATO. NATO, which was supposedly an alliance to stop the spread of the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore.
Creating an objective documentary on current events can be a daunting task for creators who want to convey the facts without any sort of bias towards one side or the other. Thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, we didn't need to spend hours skimming through headlines and copy looking for impartial coverage in researching for this video. Ground News is a website and app that combines articles from thousands of local and national outlets in one place.
Oh, there you go. They just use this app. This app finds the State Department narrative for you and just feeds it to you and then calls it unbiased. So you don't even have to do any work. What a great way to propagandize people who are trying to get into the news and trying to get into being informed, right? Oh, just this app will find what's biased and what's not for you. And then that app just feeds you State Department propaganda. What a clever little trick.
Yes. On February 21st, Putin announced that the Russian government would diplomatically recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The same evening, Putin directed that Russian troops deploy into Donbass in what Russia referred to as a peacekeeping mission. In response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ordered a 30-day nationwide state of emergency and the mobilization of all reservists. On the morning of February 24th, Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, air and missile strikes were conducted across the country. This was followed shortly thereafter by a large ground invasion along multiple fronts. Zelensky declared martial law and a general mobilization of all male Ukrainian citizens between 18 and 60 who were banned from leaving the country. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus toward Kyiv, a northeastern front toward Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Donbass.
Zelensky also banned all opposition parties and opposition media. That was the first thing that they said that was even slightly critical of Zelensky. Like, he banned people from leaving the country and, drafted them to fight Russia. But it's framed as, well, Russia invaded, so he kind of had to. When, Ukraine is being portrayed in the West as a liberal democracy versus Russia as this authoritarian fascist state or whatever. when Ukraine not only has actual fascists in their military, but they banned all opposition parties. They banned communist parties, and a whole bunch of communists have been imprisoned by the Ukrainian, the SPD, the basically Ukraine's version of the CIA or the secret police, have been banning any and all opposition. So definitely not a liberal democracy.
Many expected the invasion to be a short affair that would go in Russia's favor, with even the Americans offering Zelensky evacuation. But the Ukrainians resisted. The Northern Front, which was supposed to be a dash to Kyiv to topple the government, stalled after initially offering Zelensky evacuation. A southern front from Crimea and a southeastern front from Donbass. Many expected the invasion to be a short affair that would go in Russia's favor, with even the Americans offering Zelensky evacuation, but the Ukrainians resisted.
I wanted to hear who offered him evacuation. The Americans offered him evacuation. Gotcha. I think they did think the military operation was going to be shorter than it was, but I don't know if Russia expected NATO to go as all out as they did. And push this Ukraine's going to fight down to the last Ukrainian narrative while just continuing to dump weapons and block any effort to create a peace agreement. I don't think Russia expected the West to go all out in this proxy war as much as they did. And I didn't either. That's probably the area where my early analysis failed the most. Was I thought this was just going to be like a minor special military operation that the West was going to call it invasion. But it has escalated a great degree since then, but mostly because of NATO and the West, of course. But
the Northern Front, which was supposed to be a dash to Kyiv to topple the government, stalled after initial gains. A daring airborne assault to capture the Antonov airport also failed after the damaging of the ensuing battle, which the Russians won, rendered the airport inoperable.
And this is difficult because I listen to pretty much everything that Scott Ritter puts out, who is a military analyst and who does go into the details of, military analysis, but this isn't my area of expertise. But from my perspective, or from what I know, Russia has been taking their time and sort of playing the slow game, but it wasn't like they just wanted to march into Ukraine and seize Kiev right away. They wanted to secure the Donbass regions first and make their way and hopefully sign a peace agreement before they had to go all the way to Kiev. But of course, NATO has blocked any attempt at a peace agreement. And then the U.S. media keeps saying, Russia just wants to seize all of Ukraine, but they've been unable to because of the heroic fighting forces of the Azov battalion and the Ukrainians. So they've been trying to portray like Russia wants to seize the country, but they've been unable to because Ukraine has done so good and has fought so honorably. And I don't think that's really accurate, but, I can't go into the details of the military strategy because that is not my area of expertise.
Russians would be halted at the suburbs of Kyiv during the month-long battles of Irpin, Hostomel, and Bucha. Russian logistical issues were evidently seen, as their columns stretched for kilometers in a traffic jam. The Ukrainian military quickly took advantage of this vulnerability, ambushing Russian vehicles and further worsening their supply situation. By April, Russian command had realized that their offensive had run out of steam and decided to withdraw from the Kyiv front to redeploy elsewhere. Ukrainians later discovered that a number of civilians were executed in Bucha when Russian forces left the area. Russian fortunes.
Everybody knows about Bucha at this point. Everybody knows what that was, and I don't know what I'm allowed to say without getting banned. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word flag false, but that's what Bucha was.
Were different in the South.
It was U.S. I'll say it was U.S. atrocity propaganda, right? It was the U.S. trying to make it look like Russia had committed the worst crime imaginable. Like the same as the incubator babies that they accused Iraqi troops of taking babies and putting them on the floor, or taking them out of incubators and leaving them to die, which justified the Gulf War, where the U.S. would bomb Iraq to a pre-industrial state and sanction them, which killed 500,000 children in order to help children and help babies. So they use atrocity propaganda to justify the worst atrocities possible. That was what Bucha is. Look what Russia did. look at this atrocity that they did. Let's send more money to Ukrainian neo-Nazis so that we can fight these atrocities. When in reality, the US and NATO have been prolonging the war, leading to more deaths on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, doing nothing to prevent atrocities, while taking atrocities and blowing them up on the news to try and use them as justification for warfare.
With the recapture of the North Crimean Canal on the day the invasion started. The canal, which had previously supplied 85% of Crimea's drinking and irrigation water, was blocked by Ukraine after its Russian annexation. As such, its capture represented an important objective for Moscow. 2 days later, the siege of Mariupol began as the Russian army linked east with the separatist-held Donbass. Russian forces would also alarm the international community by attacking the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, stoking fears of a potential nuclear catastrophe. At the time of making this video, the power plant remains under Russian control. Russian troops would also attack from Crimea toward the west, with many theorizing that Russia wanted to push to Odessa and link up with the pro-Russian separatist region of Transnistria in Moldova. It was on this front that the first major Ukrainian city, Kherson, fell to the Russian army. The fall of Kherson was accompanied by the capture of Antonovsky Bridge, holding this strategic crossing over the Dnieper.
That was the first time they mentioned Odessa, by the way, which is where we now know that a bunch of pro-Maidan, pro-coup snipers fired upon civilians, killing dozens of them, and then blamed it on Russia despite no evidence. And a bunch of scholarly analyses have now been conducted, reviewing all of the evidence and determining that it was the US-backed Maidan forces that were shooting civilians in order to escalate the protests into an actual violent overthrow of the government. But yeah, I just forgot to bring that up. We just published an article about it too. And wait, no, sorry, was that Odessa where that happened, or was Odessa where the trade union building was burned? I might be mixing up my stories, but either way, two of the major events, the Ukrainian fascist burning trade unionists alive, that was in Odessa, yeah, and the Ukrainian fascists firing on civilians with snipers in order to escalate the 2014 protests into an actual violent coup and seize power of the government and filter Nazis into the actual Ukrainian military. None of this was brought up by this video. All of this was glossed over because, just like everything else they're saying in this video, or I mean everything else they're neglecting to say in this video, it makes the US and NATO look bad. So if we're propagandists, we're not even allowed to talk about it. It's all Russian propaganda. The truth is Russian propaganda. Important events that led to the conflict, Russian propaganda.
River would allow Russian forces to attack the important junction city of...
The sniper was Maidan Square. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And they were Georgian snipers. Yes, there have been, like I said, Ivan Kachanovsky, I think is the guy's name, has published a ton of scholarly analyses of the sniper events. And then Odessa was the fire, and we just published an article on Midwestern Marx about that. And actually, I turned it into a video too. I made a video summary of the Odessa fires, which is why I was getting it mixed up with the sniper attack. I had just been reading about it. But
Mykolaiv. The Russians attempted to take the city but were repelled, stopping their advance toward Odessa. In the east, the Russian army attempted to capture Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. While Kharkiv is less than 35 kilometers from the Russian border, the Ukrainians put up strong resistance. Subsequently, the city was continuously bombarded and shelled as Russian forces tried to surround the city. Although they had some success, especially toward the southeast with the taking of Izium, the Russian push toward Kharkiv ultimately petered out.
And one of the other things that's sad, and I'm sure they'll never mention this because it makes Russia look somewhat humane, is at first Russia wasn't going to bomb Ukrainian industry, or they weren't going to drop bombs on the Ukrainian infrastructure. They were going to try and avoid that. But then Ukrainians started setting up battalions behind apartment buildings, right? Using civilians as human shields and things like that. And the US and NATO kept funneling weapons, escalating the conflict and preventing a peace agreement. So eventually Russia said, we have no choice. If we want to win, if we want this operation to be successful, we have to start crushing Ukrainian infrastructure with artillery and bombs. So now, the US has helped Ukraine and brought freedom to Ukraine by prolonging this war and allowing Ukrainian infrastructure to just be devastated. to be crushed, which is why, I'm not, when I say this stuff, when I tell the truth and expose the lies about this war, it's not because I hate Ukraine. It's not because I want to see Ukraine destroyed, right? What's destroying Ukraine is NATO. What's destroying Ukraine is this imperialist project to try and use Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as a proxy to attack U.S. enemies, to attack Russia, right? So it's the U.S. and NATO using Ukraine as a proxy, as a human shield, that's getting Ukraine destroyed and leading their infrastructure to be decimated.
Amid the heightened shelling of Kharkiv on March 31st, a helicopter strike took place against an oil supply depot inside Russia in the city of Belgorod, noteworthy as it happened on the other side of the border. The Kremlin was quick to blame Kyiv, while Ukraine denied responsibility. Advance from the Donbass was slower in comparison to the other fronts, as the region had already been the setting of battles since 2014. As a result, Ukrainian troops there were already well entrenched. Meanwhile, the siege of Mariupol was underway. The battle included troops from the regular Russian army, as well as the Donetsk People's Republic militia. The urban warfare for control of the city was slow and bloody. In an official statement, the United Nations confirmed the deaths of 1,348 civilians in Mariupol.
There were so many people who died in Mariupol, including, this is where the Azov battalion was, decimated. They lost, a huge percentage of their people or their troops because they were just killed. They were killed by Russian forces, and a lot of Russians died in Mariupol too. But yeah, I believe, isn't that where Azov battalion troops ended up getting trapped too? They were hiding in a bunker and running out of food. I don't know. This war has been dragging on for so long. I'm starting to get the events. They're starting to blur together in my mind a little bit.
But warned that the true death toll was likely higher. The UN also reported that 90% of the city's residential buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The city's defenders were eventually cornered into the Azovstal steelworks, a maze of a metallurgical facility that served as a well-defensible position. As a result, on April 21st, Putin ordered Russian troops not to storm it, opting to blockade it instead. The Russians did continue to shell the steelworks, with heavy airstrikes on the 27th and 28th of April. The humanitarian crisis in the city was becoming increasingly dire, and after a visit by the UN Security General to Moscow, the United Nations and the Red Cross started to run evacuations throughout a humanitarian corridor. Many civilians were still trapped in the steelworks, although they would continue to be pulled out during the following days. By May 7th, the Ukrainian government reported that all of the civilians in the steel plant had been evacuated. With many heavily injured and low on ammunition, food, and supplies, the remaining defenders surrendered by the 20th.
So that is, they were in the steel plant, is where a lot of those Azov battalion people were, and basically under siege and almost starved to death before they finally surrendered. But this is interesting from Cobra. Remember, it's Kiev, not Kiev. The ruling class uses the fake name because there are so many news articles that show Ukraine's crimes in Kiev. Never use Kiev. Interesting. That's an interesting tactic because if in 2015 or 2016, if you Googled Ukraine or you Googled Kiev, you would get, Ukraine has a corruption problem. Ukraine has a Nazi problem. Ukraine is a puppet of Western NGOs. The media was being more honest about it. But then once the Russian intervention happened, they had to start beating the war drums and lying about what was going on and lying about the NATO influence in Ukraine. So to change the name so that people can't Google the articles that actually existed about Ukrainian fascism and Ukrainian corruption is really sneaky online propaganda tactic, which goes along with what we were talking about earlier on the stream.
Days later, Russia.
Cobra Commander, the U.S. ruling class is dumb, psychotic, and petty AF. They use Kyiv, just like they say CCP, to just be as disrespectful as possible. Could be that too, for sure, Jenny. It could also be that. I imagine it's a combination.
Russia reopened the port of Mariupol to commercial vessels following mine removal.
All right, one more. Actually, it's a linguistic difference from diverse dialects. I almost said dialectics. Kiev is less Russified. Okay. So there you go. Now we got 3 reasons that they might have started using the word Kyiv. I believe you all. I think it's probably a combination of all 3 of these reasons.
With Ukraine being a major producer of wheat, the taking, blockading, and mining of its Black Sea ports had serious global repercussions, with increased wheat prices and the threat of famine, especially in the Middle East. As a result, the Black Sea theater has also been significant. The Russian Navy drew first blood, taking control of Snake Island after their cruiser, Moskva, bombarded it. Russia has an overwhelming advantage at sea, which became even more pronounced once the Ukrainian Navy scuttled its flagship, the frigate Hetman Sahayadechny. Despite this, Ukraine managed to somewhat even the odds by sinking the Moskva with 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. However, the Kremlin denies this, claiming that it was a munition explosion caused by a fire. Eventually, Moscow and Kyiv would reach an agreement brokered with 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. However, the Kremlin denies this, claiming that it was a munition explosion caused by a fire. Eventually,
I don't remember what actually happened there. I don't remember what the truth of that one was. Sorry. I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of the conflict, I guess. We need to get Scott Ritter on the channel. He would know.
Moscow and Kyiv would reach an agreement brokered by the UN and Turkey, aiming to resume grain exports. After the retreat from Kyiv, the Russian military concentrated their efforts on the south and the east. Although they managed some advances, the Ukrainian military managed to hold the line for the most part. On the 6th of September, prompted by the wave of military aid from the west, Ukraine launched a surprise counteroffensive in Kharkiv, which successfully cleared the surrounding areas and eliminated any risk of losing the city.
That is wild that they're portraying it like a board game. I mean, that is kind of military strategy, because that's just the reality of it. You got to be like, we have this many troops here, and we know that can take out this many troops, but if we, take out this many troops, we're going to lose a bunch. You plan to have casualties, and you're kind of playing with human life like it's a board game, and that's kind of just the reality of military strategy. But for a historian, to portray it as just like a battleship game between Putin and Zelensky is pretty callous, and it's not accurate, because Zelensky is not the one, running the Ukrainian military, running the Ukrainian military strategy. That is NATO and the United States, who control Zelensky like a puppet.
15 days later, Putin announced partial mobilization, which was followed by an exodus of young Russian men from the country. In late September, Moscow would organize referendums in the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts, and hurriedly proclaimed their annexations to the Russian Federation. These oblasts were not completely occupied by Russian forces, and the majority of the international community do not recognize the claims of the annexation. At the same time, the Ukrainian military was conducting an...
There you have it, the international community again. This time just the majority of the international community, though. I guess even Armchair historian has to admit that a lot of countries actually did recognize these independent republics. But all that matters is that the majority of the people in these Donbass countries wanted to join Russia, right? So that's not an annexation. They have the right to self-determination and national sovereignty. So if they don't want to be part of the NATO puppet Nazi government that's blowing up their homes because of the language that they speak, and because they are culturally Russian, they have the right to do that. That's why they had the referendums.
Offensive in the south.
But the referendums could have been like 100-0. 100% of people voting to join Russia and 0% of people voting to stay in Ukraine. And in Crimea, it was like, 88% to 12 or even higher. Regardless, though, the U.S. will call it an annexation no matter what. They'll call it a Russian invasion no matter what. They don't give a shit about sovereignty or self-determination. They give a shit about attacking Russia because Russia is going against the economic interests of finance capitalists in the U.S. All this talk of caring about self-determination and trying to prevent annexation, it's all just gobbledygook to justify imperialist warfare for economic purposes and political purposes, but ultimately economic purposes.
Although it would take them months, the Ukrainians managed to disrupt Russian supply lines to the point that it made their positions on the western bank of the Dnieper untenable. This was worsened by an attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which was a crucial supply line. After repeated attacks and being forced back, the Russian military decided to retreat from the provincial capital back to the eastern bank, successfully completing an orderly withdrawal. In the wake of the success of the Kherson offensive, the war had shifted back to the Donbass, where Wagner Group mercenaries have been involved in intense fighting to capture Bakhmut. This stage of the war has been characterized by brutal fighting with little forward movement for either side, with sites of trenches.
And I love how they attack the Wagner Group, being like, this is a mercenary group that serves Putin. Oh, you mean like Blackwater in the U.S.? Like there are so many, or the private military contractors in the U.S.? You know, the difference is that Wagner Group actually is controlled by Putin and is controlled by the Russian state, versus Blackwater and the military industrial complex in the US control our government. And they'll start wars just because it makes them a lot of money.
And a pronounced no man's land, some have called this phase reminiscent of the First World War. A first among our videos, the conflict in Ukraine remains ongoing at the time of release. While today the front lines have become much more static than last year, now that the snow has thawed, new offensives have introduced some semblance of movement to the front once more, as Ukraine receives an increasing amount of military aid from the West. Join us next year for the 2023 recap of the war in Ukraine.
Sounds good. I think the 2022 recap was enough for now. Nothing about Boris Johnson going to Ukraine to block up a peace agreement. Nothing about Angela Merkel admitting that the U.S. never had plans to sign a peace agreement and that their NATO's goal was always to use Ukraine to attack Russia. Nothing about the millions and millions of dollars funneled into Ukraine to foment a coup in 2014. Nothing about the Ukrainian ethno-nationalists and U.S.-backed forces who burned trade unionists alive in Odessa, or who fired upon and killed dozens of civilians in Maidan Square with snipers, which escalated the protests into an actual violent coup. None of these facts, none of these factual events that happened in reality are mentioned, because those facts go against and counteract the U.S. and NATO narrative, right? So for a historian, it shouldn't matter, though. For a historian, for an academic, you should just be trying to tell the truth, right? You should be trying to lay out all the facts. Here's what happened. Here's what Ukraine and NATO did, and here's why Russia responded the way they did. Here's what Russia did and why Ukraine and NATO and Ukraine responded, right? Make your own decision. Draw your own conclusions from that. But instead, anything that might make NATO look bad, that might make the U.S. State Department look bad, that might make NATO look like the aggressors and make it look like they provoked Russia to this point, is just omitted, completely extracted from the video, versus anything that makes Russia look bad, or things that, you know, if they were seen in context, would be understandable, you know, why Russia did them, why Russia had an interest in doing these things. Is or anything that makes Russia look bad is stated, or, you know, anything that makes them look, that's in a gray area, whatever the U.S. did to provoke what Russia did is omitted. So, like, there were NATO troops lined up on the border, the Ukrainian-Russian border. That part is omitted. But what they do tell you is that Russian troops were lined up on the border in response to those NATO troops. So if you look at the issue in its full context, okay, NATO has been expanding towards Russia's borders for years. They bombed the crap out of Yugoslavia and basically occupied that area and continued to push towards Russia's borders, even though they promised that they wouldn't. Now NATO's lining up troops right on Russia's border and looking like they're going to attack. So Russia sends troops to counteract that. Similar to if Russia was lining up troops on the U.S.-Canada border, we would send troops, you know, to block them off and to prepare for an intervention, right? But if you just isolate that, if you just completely disregard that the U.S. troops or NATO troops or Ukrainian troops are even there at all, it makes it look like Russia was the aggressor. It makes it look like Russia was lining up their troops on the Ukrainian border for no reason. You can't see the context, the actions by NATO that led Russia, that provoked Russia to respond. So it's ahistorical, it's revisionist, it's nonsense, it's propaganda. Right? That video, any historian who puts that out or believes that should be ashamed of themselves, because they're obviously omitting certain facts that make Russia look bad. And like I said, you don't have to support the Russian intervention. Right? Go ahead and say that you disagree with Russia lining up troops on the Ukrainian border, and you disagree with Russia launching the special military operation. Sure, I don't care. But don't lie. Don't lie and omit the fact that there were NATO troops lined up on their border, and that Angela Merkel has said the whole goal of that was always to attack Russia. Right? At least give all the facts so you know why Russia did what they did, even if you don't support it. right? But that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to brainwash you. They're trying to propagandize you. They're trying to portray Russia as these big bad comic book villains who might come attack the US at any second. Or these big bad comic book villains who are trying to destroy Ukraine just because they felt like it one day. Meanwhile, NATO and the US continue to block a peace agreement and prolong the war and lead to Russians and Ukrainians to die in mass. Armchair propagandist. Armchair glowy. Absolutely.